Hello, everyone, and welcome to our next session of CME Palooza Spring. I am Scott Kober, co-producer of CME Palooza, and I would like to welcome everyone to our, to our Gold Lunch sponsored session. This session is sponsored by Genentech, and it is called Fear Not the Force, 20 Predictions 5 years later. Call up the slide here. So before we begin, I would like to thank all of our sponsors, our gold sponsors, Genentech and ACHL, our silver sponsors, ASIM, Forefront Collaborative, Educational Measures, Medscape, and Peer Audience. And finally, our bronze sponsors, Catamount Medical Education, Clinical Care Options, CMEology, Creative Educational Concepts, Global Education Group, Helio.com Education Lab, Impact Education, Infograph Ed, PrimeEd, Primary Care Network, Real CME, RedMed Ed, REMI, Viator Medical Communications, and Vidnico Medical Education. So as with all of our sessions, there are 3 ways to ask questions. You can use the Educational Measures text line to send in a question. The number is 267-666-0CME-0263. You can click on the Google Slides link that is found on the live page. Here's the link for you, but you can go to the live page if you're watching this live to find that. Just click on the one for the Scott sessions. Or you can tweet your question using the hashtag CMEPalooza. And I'll be kind of keeping an eye on all 3 of these methods during this session. So please feel free to offer your comments and questions, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. Finally, our speaker disclosure. So just be mindful that the opinions, discussions, and conclusions expressed are those of our panelists and do not represent an endorsement by or a position of their employer, its parent company, or their affiliates. Obviously, as many of you can see, this is our dress-up session for the day. I would like to now turn this over. First, I will show you. I kind of came. I'm dressing up as well. I brought my lightsaber in. So I would like to turn this over to John Ruggiero to begin today's lunchtime session.
All right. Thank you so much for that, Scott Skywalker. And I welcome the panel of distinguished guests with me today who are going to speak about the things that we should not be fearing. And so to just start this off, first of all, I would like to welcome Her Grace, Her Wiseness, Yoda Jasek, who is joining us from Estellas in Chicago. We have Princess Caroline Pardo, who is also joining us from Prime Education. And thanks to Princess Pardo's team at Prime Education who helped put the graphics together for us today so that you can have an enjoyable experience. We also welcome Her Emperor Jill Erickson, who is in Chicago and is behind the curtain, if you will, today, having some difficulties with visuals, but that often happens in space, so we're okay with that. And then we also welcome Darth Linsenmeyer, Jeremy, who is one of the newest members of the team at Genentech. So maybe if we can go into the next slide, Scott. Excuse me, Mr. Skywalker, that would be great. And I would like to just help everybody understand where we are today with predictions that were once made in the past. Caroline is going to start us off, and the theme of this specific section truly is the force is really strong with those who know where learning needs to be. And if we take some time to reflect on Dr. Olson's 20 predictions paper, which was specifically called 20 Predictions for the Future of CPD, Implications of the Shift from the Update Model to Improving Clinical Practice, I'd like to ask Caroline if she thinks that she could identify some key attributes of this paper. And then we're going to get into some questions and answers related to that. But Caroline, would you like to start us off?
Yeah, absolutely. So Scott, I know that we have some words that will appear here. So this is a paper that John and I have talked about a number of times. This panel has enjoyed discussing as a revisit to a paper that's really ahead of its time. And Dr. Olson, who was editor of JSIP at the time, put out this challenge to our community, and there are 20 predictions. We've summarized a few of the points here, and it's interesting to look back on these and say, where are we now, given that this is now 2018 and this paper appeared in 2012. So some key points, if we were just going to maybe boil it down to some essence points. There was a focus on a shift of the unit of learning from the individual to the team. I think we see that happening. Think about joint accreditation by the team, for the team, et cetera. So that was one of the core themes. Another of the core themes was this shift from, and just thinking about the subtitle, implications of the shift from the update model to improving clinical practice. There's a shift that are noted in the predictions around from the psychology of learning, just how people learn, to what happens if people learn effectively, or to the science of behavior change, what's actually happening when people change their behavior out of a continuing professional development activity. I think another point was this expansion of objectives of learning from beyond just clinical content or the translation of knowledge to around clinical topics, to topics that are really team-oriented and embrace the patient and the system and the context in which care happens, shared decision-making, communication and team skills, how to effectively use data, and quality improvement. And then another core category I think some of the predictions fit into is the increased complexity of learning and evaluation methods. If things are changing in the way that we design and implement education, well, then we need to think about how we evaluate those differently. And so here we see a shift from not just, is it working, but what is happening and why do we see these things happening? So that takes a shift in how we design the learning and how we would evaluate that, and designing from the end in mind at the beginning. That requires a really paradigm shift, and thinking about how we plan for these more complex, more comprehensive continuing professional development approaches.
Caroline, I think that's really interesting, and what I'm gathering from what you just said is that there is an opportunity, perhaps, if we take the interprofessional piece of the message you just gave, opportunity to rethink what medical education looks like for interprofessionals, how we all and they all learn from each other, share knowledge, and perhaps grow in practical skills. Would that be?
Absolutely. And I was trying to connect these to some things that have happened post 2012 and say, where do we see evidence of this? And just because the meeting just happened and I had a moment to reflect on this last week, the ACCME annual meeting occurred last week, and a big focus of the topics there were around the criteria for accreditation with commendation. And if you look at this advancement that those kinds of criteria call for, is paying attention to exactly that, ensuring that the whole team is progressing. There are tools to sustain change, that the design includes the patient and the context of care, and any of the tools that might be built into a continuing professional development or a CME activity would then embrace that skill building for physicians specifically, because it's ACCME, to be able to work within those interprofessional teams and with patients very effectively. It's just one example, but absolutely that interprofessional focus is just being built into so many different parts of how we even measure ourselves today.
It's really helpful to hear this. I'm going to summarize another specific message point that came in my mind. You may agree, you may not. I have the Jedi robe on, but doesn't mean I'm so correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, are we getting to a point now then perhaps through your suggestions and through Dr. Olson's suggestions that we're beyond knowledge transfer? The knowledge transfer is important, but perhaps it's understanding the context of knowledge as a base, and then how that overcomes other barriers in our programs that we develop or support. Would you say that that's correct?
It's correct. And it's correct because the whole way healthcare is being delivered today has really shifted. If we look back 5 years ago and then we even predicted what healthcare would look like today, I don't think we would have been even as bold to say that this shift toward value-based care, the shift in the model of the importance of data and quality metrics, the shift in the importance of the patient voice within everyday decision-making. And that requires this very different set of skills beyond just knowing the clinical science, but being able to work with others, work with patients, work with data, work within systems very effectively. So you're right, but I think it's not something that just is happening in our community. It's happening as a result of so many things that are happening in the environment, from policy to economics of healthcare, and certainly all the clinical advances in the therapies and approaches that are available today. That said, Curtis Olson and others who have ridden on the forefront of this said, you know what, we can't be left behind. So we need to pay attention to this, and we need to purposely shift to equip clinicians, which is our highest calling, our healthcare professionals, our high calling, to be able to deliver in that new environment.
Really, really helpful. And it's context for the stage of what we're doing today with all of you, to try to really piece together where these predictions lie right now and how we benefit from the knowledge that was within those predictions and the examples that are coming forth because of them. And so, Caroline, any remaining points before I ask my next question?
I just wanted to, I don't know that he would be listening to this today, but last year I had the opportunity to speak to Dr. Olson at the Alliance annual meeting, or the year prior. And I just said to him, hey, sir, that paper you wrote in 2012 really meant a lot to us. We've been reflecting on that, what it means. And I'm not quoting him verbatim, but he said something like, the future holds so many other things. So I think that's just the point, is that we are in a transition point across our community, but the future can hold so many other things that we can co-develop.
That's right. That's right. So fear not the force of the future. The future holds so many other things. And, you know, Scott, I think that perhaps the visual might be on me right now, but if you wouldn't mind, would you go back to the points that Caroline brought up? Because I think that this is really important for the next section. Because I'm going to ask her wiseness, Yoda Jasek, just kind of reflect on this for a second. We're talking about the shift of unit of learning from individual to a team. We're talking about the science of behavior change. We're talking about expanding learning objectives to affect or to impact shared decision-making, communication, team skills, all the interprofessional necessities that we just discussed, and then the increased complexity of learning and evaluation methods. So, Patty, your section is written in correct Yoda verbiage, achieved all the recommendations. We have not. And so, Patty, what would you suggest is a response to that? Is that correct? Have we not achieved all the recommendations? Have we achieved the recommendations? Is there a mixture somewhere of achieving some and not others? Let me just pause and let you respond to that.
Thanks, John. I think that we have achieved some of these predictions that Dr. Olson provided to us, and I think we have many that we're still framing and moving. So we're in a mixed situation right now in terms of that we have shifted, but we haven't fully shifted, and we also don't know what that shift means to many of us, and really looking at how we complete that whole paradigm shift. One of Yoda's main sayings was that we have to unlearn what you have learned. And I think that's very valid, because we really have had kind of been old schooled in what education is and what education should be. And in order to fully embrace some of these predictions, we really need to move out of that realm of what it was and into a new realm of what it can be. And I think that that really demands us to shift our mindsets as well. Several areas that we have made major headways in includes the shift from individual to team, although I would have to say in terms of looking at the data, we're probably only about 20% there. We're not fully there yet. And I think it's really different pockets in different disease states or different disease therapeutic areas that really have shifted from an individual to a team based on the necessity of the healthcare landscape. And I think we'll see more of that as we continue to see the changes in the healthcare landscape. I love the science of behavior change. I mean, you know, it takes all of us there to think about how do you actually incorporate some knowledge that you have that it becomes both a habit and then a behavior change. You can see that from the individual level, or you can speak to that from a system level. And although there's been systems components in place, you know, such as really looking at very old leadership manuals about how do you do a whole system better. We're not there just yet. And there's several good behavior scientists that are really looking at what does it take to shift behavior and how do you do that from an educational framework. I had a wonderful conversation with Hillary just a few weeks ago about that. I was sort of, my frame of mind was that you really can't shift behavior if you have a pipeline product, because your purpose of educating about a pipeline product is really to increase awareness and knowledge that this could have an impact into the therapeutic arena in the future. And she said to me that she didn't agree. And I was like, okay, tell me more. And her comment was the fact that what you can do is have the learners reflect on the fact of how they think their practice would change by using this drug and what the outcome to the patient was or will be. And so that's a very different kind of behavior component that I don't think we're yet all thinking in that same way, or even sometimes consider that. I think the other things that we're doing is that we are looking very much so at longitudinal and multidimensional educational interventions that really reach and the learner in a different way and engage them over the course of time. So many of the outcomes that are now measuring linked learning are looking at how one educational activity then builds upon another, and also allowing our learners to be able to choose where they come in and where they exit. So smaller time frames, smaller modules, smaller types of interactive, in a sense also competitive or gaming components to say, do you know where you stand compared to your colleagues? Or you know where the experts are weighing in on this particular topic, and where do you fit within all of those experts? You know, consensus is a wonderful thing, but it's very rare that we all agree. I'll take a breath now and you can ask another question.
That's the beauty. I think that disagreement is sometimes what launches us forward, because when we have diplomatic conversations about where to have happy mediums, that's what actually advances in our world patient care. And so I really like the points that you made. And Patty, extra credit to you for doing homework and quoting the actual Yoda. That's number one. And then number two, I just want to summarize some things that I think I heard. Yes, we're achieving some levels of these predictions because we're focused more on a team-based approach. Yes, we are looking at behavior change and outcomes change. And I think it's really interesting. I was on the panel of the first session today that was all about outcomes, that was moderated by Greg from CE Outcomes, and what was completely developed and I mean magnified because of the information that Karen from Regeneron and Maria from BMS shared. It had nothing to do with just me providing perspective, but there was a lot of a context about it's truly about the gap, and sometimes the outcomes change based on what that gap is, and sometimes even the platform changes based on what that gap is. As long as we go back to the gap, and the gap is focused on team-based learning and behavior change, we might see tremendous things like Dr. Olson suggested to Caroline, that the future holds many, many bright things. But however, one thing I wanted to ask you, Patty, sustainability. So yes. Do you think that we've been as good in making sure that the education is embedded within the workplace? Are we meeting performance objectives? What's your thought?
I think we're slightly there. I think we're on kind of the foothold, and we need to really, climb the mountain a little more, to use that analogy. Because what happens is we believe that we have sustainability. We have some evidence that we do have sustainability, but we don't have true capability of measurement of that over time. And I think it's going to take several demonstration projects or demonstration research educational activities to say, here's one way of doing that actually can be measured and is proves that it's sustainable. I think other ways of doing that is really also implementing, and you're finding that this is happening now in the healthcare landscape, that what also causes sustainability is the impact from the landscape. So some of the cost factors are causing changes that will be sustained over time. Some of them are causing different healthcare professionals to interact in different ways or to provide support to patients and their outcomes. A good example is when you have the patient concierge service. Like, does it make a difference if you follow up with that patient? Does it make a difference if someone in the ER calls that ER patient the next day and asks them how they're doing and gets them to the clinic, makes sure they have that appointment? There's so many disconnects that happen that are the result of individuals and not necessarily the system, but the system can own those disconnects and create innovative means of moving forward so that those don't happen as often or may never in the future happen based on how well the system designs its interventions.
One last question with that then, because I feel like we're seeing the world, or perhaps the forceful use this way. My question to you is, do you think there are some exposure points for us as an educational community if we're not meeting some of these predictions anytime soon? What do you think rises to the surface in your mind?
I would have to say that one of the new initiatives that the Alliance for CME is taking on is the education curriculum, and I think it's really looking at understanding that the role of the Alliance is really to educate the educator. And so I think we've not all been in the same place at the same time and have built a repertoire as well as a novice to expert component of what that means and how do we evaluate our success in that. And so I think we're on the right road and we're on an uphill climb, but I feel very positive that we've gotten this far, and all of us that are on the panel today and those listening have seen tremendous changes in education, not only with the governance that's been forced upon us in the US, but just as to how we're doing it and what we're funding and what we want to fund and how we want to close that gap. So I do think we're well on our way. We just need to keep climbing.
Thank you, Patty, for that. Let me just pause and see if anybody across the panel has any comments to share or input based on what Patty said. Okay, if not, look at that 3-second pause. Opportunity missed. That's all. I'm just joking, because our next section really takes us deeper into some of the things that Caroline and Patty just mentioned. That truly is the return of this Jedi team. Okay, in the spirit of this fun time that we're having with Star Wars, really it comes down to this spirit that we all have within us, that we are capable of so much and affect so much change, and we should just be proud of what we do every single day, and that it takes an interprofessional collective team of individuals who become that collective much stronger than what individuals could do alone. That includes everyone from providers to supporters to clinician providers to patients and caregivers. It includes people across the varied responsibilities of a team. It even includes the Star Wars nerf herders. So I'm going to go to Jill Erickson. And Jill, we learn as a team. Some would suggest that clinicians for a long time now have practiced as individuals for years. And these predictions and the changing dynamics of healthcare, as we heard summarized by Caroline, and then also by Patty, are emphasizing the need to revert back to that team-based clinical decision-making, which changes the whole dynamic about how patients are receiving care now. And therefore, I believe, changes the way we approach education. So what are some of the points to help us all understand where the primary point of learning is shifting from the individual to the team. Do you have any examples to share or any input to provide?
Absolutely, John. Thank you. And if you could see me, I am dressed like a Jedi and would say, be bold like a Jedi. But, you know, I'd like to just start out with a story. And I think probably all of us have had similar experiences, but it speaks to the importance of team-based learning and team-based care. Recently, I had a really good friend who experienced a life-altering and threatening, quite frankly, experience after surgery. And despite the fact that he had world-renowned physicians and systems he was receiving care in, the experience was challenging and very difficult to navigate. And as I reflected on some of the points where things broke down, the gaps, if you will, they really weren't related to the knowledge or skills, even competencies of individual providers, but rather a result in breakdowns in the coordination of care, the communication amongst team members, and really importantly, keeping my friend, the patient, at the center of that care and the decisions that were made collectively as a team that would influence his outcomes and experience with that care. On top of that, of course, as some of you mentioned, there were added complexities related to fragmented healthcare technology and really misalignments of the reimbursement of care and the incentives across some of the stakeholders you mentioned, the payers, clinicians, and the health systems. One thing to reflect on too is within Olson's predictions, he referenced team-based learning and interprofessional education, the shift from the individual to the team 8 times in those 20 predictions. And I think about the professional societies and patient advocacy groups that we partner and work with. Each one of them, the accreditation bodies, has a goal and initiative to improve team-based care, to modify how we learn, and to really focus on the team. It's for good reason. There's data that show, and you all know, that effective team-based care has demonstrated positive impact across really the quadruple aim of better care, better health at a lower cost. And I think importantly too, a better experience for both patients, but also clinicians and care teams. Caroline mentioned the ACCME conference, and she and I had a chance to talk about a session that demonstrated through data the benefits of team-based learning, really creating that human connection. And our educational strategies, we have to change to look at the team and to really understand the context in which the team works and the intersection between their roles and interdependencies between team members. I think additionally, something that's important for us to think about now and in the future, even since Olson's paper, the models of care are changing. Patty referenced the concierge service. We also are continuing to evolve in the areas of telehealth, retail clinics, digitally enabled care, and the power of technology to help us work better as teams is there. It's within our reach, but we have to, as a group, really identify the impact it could have on how individual clinicians practice, how patients engage in their care, and collectively how can we positively leverage the different and evolving models of care, including technology, to improve how teams work together, how patients are engaged, and how we can help to create or support learning initiatives that will really drive beyond knowledge, but drive true behavior and practice change.
Jill, respond to the following 3 points, or should I say, perhaps react to the following 3 points, which I think, doing my best, are trying to highlight the really strong message that you just had. 1, there's an importance of including patients as a member of the decision-making process. 2, we need to all understand the context of the intersection between how individuals work within a system. And then 3, in order to change the individual, you need to have collective solutions so that followers and adopters actually wind up changing along with them. So I appreciate your reaction to that.
Well, thank you, Jen. I think you summarized that beautifully. Number one, yes, patients need to be a member of the team. I think from a supporter perspective or a provider perspective, when we look at what the care gap is, what are the problems that we're trying to solve for, we really must, and we talk about this and we do a good job, but we must put the patient at the center and understand, what is the problem for them that we are trying to solve for, and how do they interact with different members of their care team or the system? How does financial implications and the healthcare environment impact the patient? That's where we have to start. That's part of the context of the entire healthcare ecosystem, right? And we also have to understand the context of how clinicians and teams are practicing, as well as the broader context. I think we need to think about the team very broadly, from the individual level, but then to the clinical team, to the leadership within an organization, and then beyond that to the communities in which they practice, gaps, policies, et cetera, that are impacting the decisions that patients and clinical care teams make. If we want to find collective solutions, we really have to understand that context of care, and that's challenging and difficult. And I think one of the things that we can do as educators and as providers is really step out of our offices and get experience within the context of the gaps or the healthcare problems that we're seeking to solve, so that we can truly understand the nuances and then take those nuances to help guide the design of the learning initiatives that will include education, but also, I think as Caroline mentioned and others, can include tools and support for both patients, care teams, and other healthcare stakeholders that can help to really nudge or drive true behavior change and help patients, clinicians, and systems sustain those changes over time.
We keep talking about a team-based approach. I've heard it now from Caroline. I've heard it from Patty. I've heard it from you. I assume that I'm going to be hearing it for the remainder of this session as well. I think that as an educational community, we believe we've already been addressing this, especially if we're triple accredited, or especially if we repurpose education for not just physicians, but then tailor it to the nurses and the pharmacists or whomever else may be the recipient of that education. Do you think that's enough? And it's okay if you say yes. I'd really like to have your insight on that. And perhaps maybe even ask Caroline and Patty for theirs too after yours.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a good question. Actually, it's one of my biggest pet peeves when we take education and think that by repurposing it, it's going to drive change in another set of learners, whether it's an individual learner or a care team. I think it's a good start, and perhaps in some instances, right, it could have impact. But really, one of the things that's difficult, but we have to understand, is that learning and change is iterative, it's ongoing, and we have to be able to be agile and adapt to those needs. While complex, what we think will help drive change after we actually get into it and understand the context again of where people are living, caring, and working, some of the changes and then the strategies to drive change, they need to evolve. It's almost like the learning healthcare system, right? We need to understand the data and the evidence, understand the gaps, use that to help design interventions, but continue to learn from that and recognize the fact that one set of learning or educational interventions it's not a one size fits all. So we can't make that assumption that if we develop education for one type of provider, that it's going to necessarily meet the needs of another type of provider or for a team of providers. We have to really constantly, I think, critically look at what is developed and make changes to really meet the needs of those who we're trying to serve. Not easy, but necessary to drive sustained change.
Thank you for being so honest. I would agree with what you said, and I'm really interested to see what Caroline may have to say based on that same type of question.
Yeah, no, thank you. Scott, sorry, but I agree with her point so strongly. It seems like we keep agreeing with points, but it was well worded. I would just like to add, and I think we're all aligned on this, is it's messy. It's really messy work. Having a triple accredited program, or one for physicians, nurses, and pharmacists, if it's engineered appropriately, can meet the goals. Again, if it's gap-based and really focused on the root cause analyses appropriately, like Patty mentioned, but it still can be really messy. And to think about bringing, other stakeholders in, and patients, and thinking, even imagining that one set of materials would be hitting all of those needs and do it over time, or hit different contexts of care and have the same impact, isn't even realistic anymore. So it's good to have those bases, but this is where that foundation of content, but this is where having tools or resources or some sort of sustainable packages around those content pieces can help make content more applicable to a broader team, a broader stakeholder group, patients, and even in the individualized context of care. But at the end, it, just as Jill said very articulately, which I just summarized into, it's messy. It is, and it's complex.
Thank you. I agree with the message. Sorry. Feedback. Everybody, if you're hearing that too, we're going to work through it, because I'd really like to get Patty's response. Patty, do you have anything to add to what Caroline just added?
Sure, and I agree with both Caroline and Jill. What I would like to add is that I think that one of the issues at play here is actually the accreditation requirements. And so the requirements themselves for both nursing, pharmacy, and physicians require something related to data and content. And I would like people to consider that in order for us to achieve really, truly team-based systems learning, that it may not always be driven by clinical content, but instead be driven by the interactions based on the roles of the healthcare professionals that are interacting to take care of that patient and their family or their loved ones. And I don't think we've gotten there yet. We may need to in fact, suggest that maybe we need to do some non-accredited activities that are team-based, that really look at that system interaction and what the roles are, and how they interact, and where there are gaps and holes within that context. The clinical data is essential. We need to know what it is that we're doing for the patient and why, and understand what's happening with that. But more essential is the interventions and the interactions between all of those players that can impact on the patient.
That's awesome, Patty. That's awesome. For those, this is a really nice segue into our next section. It looks like Scott, maybe perhaps there's a comment or question. Scott, you might be on mute.
Yeah.
Okay.
So this is a question that came in, and it's something that you might need to think about from it. So I'm going to pose it to you, and then maybe you can come back to it later. So this came over our educational measures text line. So here's the question. So if you were authoring the sequel to Dr. Olson's article today, what would be your #1 prediction for the CME world 5 years from now?
Oh, I promise that we that question. We're actually getting to that toward the end. So if
excellent.
Awesome question can promise to be patient with us, we promise we will try to get to that.
Sounds good.
Okay. Because everything we just discussed is a really nice segue into the next section, which is really not going to take long, because so many of you have heard this already. For those of you that follow Star Wars really religiously, if you will, like I think we all do, or maybe I'm just speaking for myself. Jill said one thing that I thought was interesting. She said that Dr. Olson recommended in his paper 8 different times the team-based approach, the need to bring teams into the educational process, and that also happens to be the official number of episodes of Star Wars movies.
Oh my gosh.
Number two, if you follow the movie, the spirit of the movie is that there's a character in every single episode that always says, I have a bad feeling about this. And we're taking a positive spin on this, and we're saying that we have a good feeling about this. Because our next section is truly about what has emerged as an opportunity for our educational environment, our educational ecosystem, if you will, and that was the CMS ruling. I want everybody to think about this for just one moment. CMS, federal organization, under messy conditions, for the first time ever, specifically was in agreement with the work that the Alliance, the CEAM Coalition, and various important organizations recommended to them, which was that CME can be used as a clinical practice improvement activity, meeting MIPS measures. And the recommendation was, if we follow these 5 specific criteria, and we may not yet know how to exactly follow those 5 criteria, but it's a start. If we follow these 5 criteria, it could achieve CPIA credit status for the institutions that are adhering to MIPS. A tremendous opportunity in front of us. I was very proud to work with these institutions, these other organizations, representing Genentech as a member of the CME Coalition as well. I was proud to do what I could to help in this collective solution offering. Every person on the panel, from Prime Education to Takeda to Astellas, everybody was involved in building a story with the CME Coalition to try to advance that effort. And we truly believe that this is an opportunity. And it perhaps starts first with activating a system around what their clinical problem might be, getting them to collectively advance solutions, using education as the catalyst for that. And obviously, education alone may not be the only thing that gets them where their measures are met, but just using that as a way to drive some of those criteria, that's that CMS opportunity. So I was intending to pause just to see what everybody's reaction to that. But before I do, I think it might be better to first introduce you to Jeremy Linsenmeyer from the Genentech team, because I think after he's done, he's going to present perhaps what keeps systems up at night and what keeps individual clinicians up at night. And then I'd like to just get reactions from everybody based on what I just said about the CMS ruling opportunity, what that opportunity looks like for our community, and then what Jeremy has to say. And I'm so proud to work with Jeremy. Number one, he's a medical doctor. He has some responsibility, or had some responsibility, in his medical profession, organizing educational development opportunities for his colleagues when he was working within the health systems. He worked in industry, specifically in drug safety. And then now he is serving the educational community as a supporter of education. So just thinking back, Jeremy, to your perspective as a practicing clinician employed by a larger system, what would you say are the specific issues that keep a health system up at night these days?
Well, thank you very much, John. That was a very kind introduction. I'm fortunate to work with a Jedi Master like yourself every day.
Thank you, Sarah.
You know, there is such a long list of issues that are likely keeping health system leaders up at night. I left clinical practice less than 10 years ago, and in that time, the healthcare landscape has evolved in many of the ways that we've already discussed today. The challenges facing the systems are becoming increasingly complex. So some of the big issues that come to mind that you already mentioned include new healthcare policy, and I think also concerns about what future policy will be. Changes to reimbursement from a volume-based or a fee-for-service type model to the value-based model. Tightening margins, systems have to do more with less. An evolving customer, so now patients are more engaged, which is a great thing, but which requires systems to adapt. There's an explosion in data. So we have access to data from all different sources, in part because of the technological advances that have occurred. And those technological advances, again, provide great opportunity, but bring complexity and also some risk. And then finally, you know, what we think about a lot in CME is this constant evolution of evidence. So more evidence about health, disease, and disease management. And so, if I try and think as a health system leader and how can I synthesize all these specific issues, I really think about it in terms of the triple aim. So, that's not a new goal. To improve the health of the population that you serve, to improve the care of the patients, and to decrease cost. But I think all these specific issues and the increasing complexity just put more pressure on systems to achieve that goal. So there's urgency, there's time pressure to achieve the triple aim, because health systems need to keep up with the policy and the reimbursement models that are increasingly looking at value through the lens of the triple aim. There's pressure to demonstrate and to document that your outcomes in this system are aligned with the triple aim. And finally, there's pressure in terms of finances. I mean, health systems are under increasingly strict financial pressures. I just read recently that the median operating margin of public health or nonprofit hospitals was about 2.7% in 2016, which was less than the year before, and low when you look at a lot of other industries. So health systems are being asked to do more with less. And I think even as a Jedi, if I was a health system leader, I would probably have some sleepless nights due to these complex issues.
It's really interesting, Jeremy, and I think that you really help expose to everybody who's listening these major issues that individuals and leaders and collective systems together have to face today. Do you think that there's any opportunity for education to help mitigate some of these concerns? What's your reaction?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I would not be in this role if I didn't think so.
Tell us a little bit about that. Are you actually surprised you're in this role?
Yeah, I mean, as a young Jedi in training, I never imagined myself on the dark side here. I left medical practice because I wanted to have a broader impact on patient care. And I really believe that education, especially as it's evolving in all the ways that we're talking about, has the ability to change physician and clinician behavior, to improve system performance, and ultimately to improve patient outcomes on a broad scale. So yeah, absolutely. I think you addressed some of the ways that education can do this specifically with the new CMS ruling and directly tying CME to reimbursement by allowing it to serve as a performance improvement activity under MIPS. But if we look at the triple aim more broadly, I think education really has the ability to have an impact, but I think it needs to continue to evolve. I'm just reflecting on some of the different hospitals and systems that I've worked in. If I look at even the same specialty in the same city or even the same quality measure, if you look at a VA hospital and an academic medical center and a children's hospital, the issue or the end result may be the same, but the specific barriers that are preventing that quality metric from being met can be very different. So I really think that education needs to be tailored to the setting where it's delivered. And that can start with a local needs assessment to really uncover what are the issues within this system. And you can use that to then activate that system. And education can advance the care team to develop solutions that are really tailored to those specific issues. And, we talked a lot about the team. And one point that I was thinking there is that even for the same disease, the team can be very different in different settings. If you look at the community setting, which may not have the resources, the team that's caring for a patient with lung cancer could be very different than the team that's caring for a similar patient in an academic medical center. So I think it's important to really look at the specific issues within those systems. And that's a lot about talking about population health, but even when we get to thinking about cost, thinking about improving the care experience, I think education has a huge opportunity there. We've talked about shared decision-making and bringing in the patient voice to education. That can certainly improve the care experience for patients. And I think when you bring the team together and you try and uncover these system-specific issues, one thing that I think naturally falls out is inefficiencies in areas of waste. And if you work on those together as a team, you often can save money as a system. So I'm absolutely hopeful that education can address some of these issues that health system leaders are having. In my short time in this particular role, I've seen really tremendous expertise within the CME community. So I am hopeful. I think that we can make a big impact. We just have to keep.
Thank you. Thank you for that contribution. That's very helpful. And before I have everyone reflect on the last 3 to 5 minutes, which is going to include what I just suggested before Jeremy spoke, and also just getting to the future, I see Scott might have a comment.
Yeah, so this is a question, so it looks like it came from a supporter. So here's the question that kind of ties to a little bit what Jeremy was talking about and some others before. How can providers work with their faculty and planners to get buy-in on team-based learning that is not so siloed? And how can we as supporters potentially help with that?
Would somebody like to take that? Just jumping in is fine, and I might have a perspective too.
I think one thing that comes to mind is showing examples of where this has worked in the past. I think if if leaders, really any stakeholder has something that they can touch and feel, examples of where these system-based interventions have really worked and provided outcomes, and depending on the audience, the outcomes that different stakeholders might find valuable might need to be presented differently. But I really feel like concrete examples help leaders really understand the value of this.
So Jeremy, what you might be saying, which is in my mind too, many health systems across the nation are going through transformation. They're going through transformative times. They're getting ready for penalties in 2019. They're getting ready for goal achievement exposure. They're looking for solutions, and their teams are becoming more collective and collectively thinking beasts, if you will. And when identifying a specific clinical problem that needs to be met, or else the institutional goal will not be met, they are all in when presented an opportunity to help them, not some of those issues that they will face in 2019. So that was my perspective. I don't know, Caroline or Patty, if you have a perspective based on that good question.
Patty?
I would have to disagree with what both John and Jeremy said. I think that the penalties and the healthcare landscape is going to predetermine that there has to be a response. And that response has to be as
and I was just going to say, having oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. I apologize. I was just going to say very quickly, we have seen where there are packages of tools and education that can be customized further by the team to address their very specific gaps. That I think meets some of the real aims and the need that Jeremy, I think, was speaking to, where the system knows what their problems are, perhaps a little bit more data needs to help them really see their own gaps. But then after they see that, they're all in on a solution. So having them have a voice in that solution set, which can and should likely include education, but might need to include some process change or some other pieces that they can help engineer in and lead, is really important. And then being able to be a partner with them to measure that, to see what else, as Jill said, is iteratively needed to spark improvement is really important.
So as Yoda once said, do or do not, there is no try. Let's stop resisting. Let's stop resisting what is in front of us as opportunity, not as negative consequences or challenges that should not be met. And so many people have been trying to think through solutions of how we advance the educational industry. And in the last 2 minutes, just sharing some of those examples and asking for reflective feedback from the panel, there are great models and frameworks that exist to help education make impact. Of course, we have Don Moore's et al. Model that helped build a foundation for individual knowledge gain and leading to potential improvements throughout the community. There are comparative frameworks across the landscape like Scrum and Lean Six Sigma. There's Harvard Business School's case method training model. You all know that I did a lot of work within the expanded model for, the expanded learning model for systems, or TELMS. Caroline was instrumental in the development and revision of that. The people on this panel have been instrumental in the refinement of that. There is an incredible amount of resource out there that if we were asked the question, like we were asked earlier, what will we predict is the future? I would like to take just a moment to respond to that. But first, please know that the panel you see right here in front of you is moving forward with submitting a paper that is based on these conceptual frameworks, the comparative nature of them. And it will include TELMS, the TELMS model, and why we think that is achieving some of these health system pressures. We are going to be presenting an amazing agenda at the Alliance Industry Summit, which has been led by a committee, which has been led by Anthea and Shunda, and very, very insightful, very volunteer-driven and passionate people. I really encourage you to go to that AIS meeting because there's going to be so many things discussing these topics. So now back to that good question. What will you all say is a prediction for the future? Maybe Caroline, we start with you.
Okay. One of the core pieces that we discussed here today was stakeholder involvement. And I think there's a growing recognition that we can't, one individual group, one individual party, one stakeholder cannot solve this on their own. So that collectiveness around identifying a problem and then building out a collective solution within systems, within groups, within centers is going to be so critical. And when folks generally gather that way, training, education, tools, quality improvement, practice improvement naturally rises to the surface as a way to solve problems. So I see an increased value of CPD generally.
Caroline, that's great. That's great. Jill, any input on that?
Thanks. Actually, to build on what Caroline said, I think as we all know, healthcare is going to continue to transform rapidly. Within all of it, one of the things that I consistently hear as critically important is the need for human connection. I think it will remain and become even more important as technologies change and evolve, as new stakeholders enter into the field. So I think for providers and supporters, we will rise to the occasion, use learning as a catalyst for change across systems and stakeholders. And my prediction and hope is that we will also intentionally use learning as an opportunity to create and deepen human connection between healthcare professional teams, importantly, patients and their providers. And if we can do that, we will be in a very good place.
Jill, that is great. For the sake of time, I apologize to Jeremy and Patty for not being able to get their final point, and I want to give Scott the appropriate time to advance to the next session. We hope we've awakened the force within you. That was truly the last point that we were to make in the specific agenda. For those that are not aware, Jedi robes are really hot. So I think it's perfect timing that we're ending before I pass out. But I really want to thank the panel because they spent an incredible amount of time with me trying to prep for a best experience possible for all of you. I thank my colleague as well, Mihan Zakaria, who helped me build this agenda, who could not be with us today. But we just thank you for being available. We're sorry we probably couldn't get to questions or comments. I'm sure Scott will help us figure out a way to reinforce that in a way to get the questions later.
All right. Well, thank you very much, John, and thank you very much to this panel for a wonderful session. As you know, much of the Star Wars lingo went way over my head. So maybe next year you guys will focus on basketball or something. So for those folks who are watching this live session, and if you could please complete the survey link at the top of the live tab, this is sort of our outcome study to get a sense of who's watching these sessions and sort of feedback to help us plan for the future. And if you are planning on watching the next session, which I hope we are, once we close this browser, you can just refresh the live page and the next session will be up momentarily at the top of this hour. So thanks to John and Patty and Jill and Jeremy and Caroline once again, and we will see everyone soon.